Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. This is episode 27, 28, something along that line. Regardless of all that, last we left off, oh yeah, this is the, rather, tale of the dude who avoids getting drugged and then one thing leads to another, and now he's on the run from essentially the Peruvian mob, I think, who has a drug that can zombify people. It's a real adventure. It's a real pulp story, you know? Anyway, let's get back into it with chapter 5, 6, 7, 8. Crouched at the edge of the jungle, where the clearing began, Paula heard 4 shots, 2 in quick succession, and then a wait of minutes. And then a third, and then another long wait, and then the last, and then silence. Paula began to shiver. Belle had helped her ashore from the raft and insisted on her waiting at the edge of the jungle. "Not that you'll be any safer," he told her grimly, "but I may be. One person can move more quickly than 2, and if I'm chased, I'll plunge for the place you're hidden and you can open fire. Then the 2 of us might hold them off." "Why?" And Belle caught at her wrist at that. "Don't let me hear you talk like that. We're gonna beat this thing. We've got to. And being desperate helps, but being in despair doesn't help a bit. Buck up." He frowned at her until she smiled. "I won't despair again without your permission. Really, I won't." With that, he found her a hiding place and went cautiously out into the clearing, still frowning. He had been gone 5 minutes before the first shot sounded, and quite 10 before the last rang out dully, and was echoed and re-echoed hollowly by the jungle trees. And Paula lay waiting by the edge of the clearing, Ribiera's pearl-handled automatic in her hand. Belle had carried the rifle from the plane. Small insects moved all about her, and she heard soft rustlings as the life of the jungle went on over her head and under her feet, and terror welled up in her throat. She was trembling almost uncontrollably when Belle came back. He walked openly toward her hiding place. "Paula." She came out, trying to steady her quivering lips. "We're all right. This is the fazenda of a sub-deputy. I suspect also it's an emergency landing field for Ribiera, on the way to that place he talked to last night. There's a 2-place plane here with both wheels and floats in a filthy little shed. It seems to be all right. We're going to take off in it and try and take Moradores, where your people are. What's the matter?" Her face was deathly pale. I thought, when I heard the shots, I thought you were killed." Belle shook his head. I wasn't. It was 4 other men who were killed." He led her carefully past the house. It was a fairly typical fazenda dwelling, if more substantial than most. It was wholly unpretentious, with whitewashed walls and the effective grandeur it would give to the natives of this region. Would come solely from the number of buildings. There were a half-dozen or more. "I killed 4 men, and I'm glad of it. That scream we heard, I know pretty well what happened here last night. Remember, Ribiera spoke of using a beam wireless to make his report. He must have had a shortwave beam set somewhere on the outskirts of Rio, aimed at whatever headquarters he reports to. He's going up to that headquarters sometime today by plane, of course. He needed emergency landing fields along the route, and he re-picked out a native and made him a sub-deputy. Charming." Moving past the buildings, Paula caught sight of massive wooden bars set inside of a building. Something crumpled up and limp lay before them. "Don't look over there. There was a woman in this house. She told me what happened, though I'd guessed it before. The sub-deputy was here last night with a party of friends, newly enslaved some of them. He entertained them up at Riviera's place. A girl told me she and her husband had been shown a Secret Serviceman. He went mad before their eyes. It was an object lesson for them. A clear illustration of what would happen to them if they ever disobeyed. I imagine it's something of the sort used by all the master's deputies, to convince their thralls of the fate that awaits them for disobedience. The local man had brought a party up to watch 2 men go mad. After that sight, they'll be obedient." He reached a shed, huge but in disrepair. Monster doors were ajar, and so Belle heaved at them and swung them wide. A small, trim, two-seated plane showed in the shadowy interior. This is for an emergency, and we face an emergency. I'll get it out and load it up. There's a dump of gas and so on here. You might look around outside the door in case the one man who got away can find someone to help stop me. He set to work checking on... He set to work checking on fuel and oil. He loaded extra gas in the front cockpit, a huge tin of it. Another would crowd him badly in the pilot's cockpit in the rear, but he stowed it as carefully as he could. The local sub-deputy is added to the thrill by having two men put in one cage. He let his guests observe the progress of the madness that the poison produces. Presently, as the madness grew, the two men fought. They were murder mad. The local sub-deputy gave his guests the thrill of watching maniacs battling to the death. He left early this morning with his party, and I imagine that everyone was suitably submissive to his demands for the future. There were 4 men and a woman left as caretakers here. I had found the 4 men before the cage, baiting the poor devil who'd killed the other last night. That's why we heard the scream. When I came up with my rifle, they stared at me and ran. I got one then, and as a matter of mercy, I put a bullet through the man who'd gone murder mad. The bell sounded as if he were acutely nauseated at this. The man he'd killed was still in the cage. Then I went looking for the other 3 men. Wasting time, no doubt, but I found them. I was angry. I got one, and the others ran away again. A little later, the 3rd man jumped me with a knife. He slit at my sleeve, but I killed him. I didn't find the 4th man. Belle moved to the front of the plane. I'll see if she catches. He swung on the stick, and it went over stiffly. Again and again, and eventually, with a bellow, the motor caught. Belle shouted in Paula's ear. We'll get in. We'll use the warming-up period to taxi out. We want to get her away as soon as we can. He helped her up into the seat and then remembered. He rummaged about and flung a tumbled flying suit up in the cockpit with her. If you get a chance, put it on. He stepped into a similar outfit, reached up and throttled down the motor, and kicked away the blocks under the wheels. He then vaulted up into place, and slowly, clumsily, the trim little ship came lurching and rolling out of the shed. The landing field wasn't large, but Belle took the plane to its edge. He faced it about and bent below the cockpit combing to avoid the slipstream and look at his maps again, brought from the big amphibian. Something caught his eye, another radio receiving set. Amphibian planes for landing on Earth or water, and radios. I wonder if he has a directional for a guide. It would seem sensible, and if a plane went down, the rest of them would know where to look. Paula reached out and touched his shoulder. There she pointed, and there was movement at the edge of the jungle, and a puff of smoke. A bullet went through the fuselage of the plane, inches behind Belle. He frowned, grasped the stick, and gave the motor the gun. Sorry, I'm just rearranging things. It lifted heavily like all amphibians, but it soared over the group of buildings some 20 or 30 feet above the top of the wireless mast, and went on, rising steadily, to clear even the topmost trees on the farther side of the stream by 100 feet or more. It went on, roaring upward, and the jungle receded ever farther beneath it. The horizon drew back and back, and at 2,000 feet the earth began to have the appearance of a shallow platter. At 3,000 it was a steep-sided bowl, and Belle could look down and trace the meandering of the stream on which he had landed the night before. Not too far downstream, some 15 miles perhaps, were the squalid, toy-sized structures of a town on the far interior of Brazil. He never learned its name, but even in his preoccupation with the management of the plane and a search for landmarks, he wondered very grimly indeed what would be the state of things in that town. If in Rio, where civilization held sway, Ribeira exercised such despotic though secret power, in a squalid and forgotten little village like this, the rule of the sub-deputy, the master, could be bestial and horrible beyond belief. They headed eastward. Bell had overshot the mark the night before. Before he had located himself, he was quite 50 miles beyond the spot Apollo had suggested as a hiding place, and now he retraced his steps. A peak jutting up from far beyond the horizon was a guiding mark, and he set the plane's nose for it and relaxed. The motor thundered on valorously, and far below there was a vast expanse of thick jungle, intercepted but nowhere broken, by occasional small streams and now and again the tiny angular things which might be houses. But these houses were very infrequent. In the first 10 miles, with a view of 20 miles in every direction, Bell picked out no more than 4 small groups of buildings which might be unspeakably isolated fazendas of the folk of this region. Ribiera was coming this way. He fumbled the headphone of the radio set into place, and the set seemed to be arbitrarily tuned. He turned it on, and there was a monotonous series of flashes with the singing note of a buzzer in them, a radio direction signal. Ribiera's on the way. Bell stared far ahead without reason, and it seemed to him that just then, against that far distant guiding peak, he saw a black speck floating in midair. He pulled back the joystick. Detached, feathery clouds spread across the sky, and he was climbing for them. Paula looked behind him, and he pointed. He saw her seem to stiffen upon the sight of another aircraft. In minutes, Bell's plane was tearing madly through sunlit, fleecy monsters, which looked soft and warm and alluring, but they were cold and damp and blinding in their depths. Bell kept on his course. The 2 planes were approaching each other at a rate of nearly 200 miles an hour. And then, while the harsh, discordant notes of the radio signal sounded monotonously in his ears, Bell stared down and through a rift between 2 clouds saw the other plane for an instant, 1,000 feet below. The sun shone upon it fiercely. Its propeller was a shimmering, cobwebby disk before it, and it seemed to hang motionless, so short was Bell's view of it, between earth and sky, a fat, glistening body of a monstrous insect. Bell could even see figures in its cockpits, and then it was gone, but Bell felt a curious hatred of the thing. Ribiera was almost certainly in it, headed for the place to which he'd spoken the night before, and Bell was no longer able to think of Ribiera with any calmness. He felt a personal, gutsy hatred for the man and all he stood for. His face was grim and savage as his own plane sped through the clouds. But just as the 2 aircraft had approached each other with the combined speed of both, so they had separated. It seemed only a moment later that Bell dipped down below the clouds, and the other plane was visible only as a swiftly receding mote in the sunlight. "I wonder," said Bell coldly to himself as the thunder of the motor came through the singing of the air route signal. "I wonder if you'll see the ship I cracked up last night." Paula was pointing again. The shoulder of a hill upthrust beneath the jungle, and the tall trees were cleared away at its crest. Small, whitewashed buildings appeared below. "It's a good landing field on the direct route. 50 miles back there's another landing field. I wonder." He was already suspicious before he flattened out. He was already suspicious before he flattened out above the house, while dogs fled madly. He noticed, too, that horses in a corral near the buildings showed no signs of fright, and horses are always afraid of landing aircraft, unless they've had much opportunity to grow accustomed to them. That little plane rolled and bumped and gradually came to a stop. Bell inconspicuously shifted a revolver to the outer pocket of his flying suit, while figures came toward them, with a certain hesitating reluctance that changed Bell's suspicions even while it confirmed them. "Paula, this is another landing field for Ribiera's emergency use. It sticks out all over the place. Relatives or no relatives, you want to make sure of them, you understand?" Her eyes widened in sudden, startled fear, and she caught her breath sharply. But she continued quietly, though her voice trembled. "I understand, of course." She slipped out of the plane and advanced to meet the approaching figures. There were surprised, astounded exclamations. A bearded man embraced her and shouted. Women appeared, and after staring, embraced her as well. Paula turned to wave her hand reassuringly to Belle and vanished inside the house. Belle looked over his instruments, examined the gas in the tank, and began to work over his maps in the blaring sunlight. He cut out the switch and the motor stopped with minor hissings of compression. The maps held his attention, though he listened keenly as he worked for any signs of trouble that Paula might encounter. He was beginning to have a definite idea in his head. Ribiera had talked to a headquarters somewhere by beam radio from Rio. Beam wireless, of course, is nothing more or less than a concentration of a radio signal in a nearly straight line, instead of allowing it to spread about equally on all sides of the transmitting station. It makes both for secrecy and economy, since nearly all the power used at the sending apparatus is confined to an arc of about 3 degrees of a circle. Directed to a given receiving station, receiving outfits to one side or the other of that path are unable to listen in, and the signal is markedly stronger in the chosen path. Exactly the same process, of course, is used for radio directional signals, one of which still buzzed monotonously in Belle's ears until he impatiently turned it off. A plane in the path hears the signal. If it doesn't hear the signal, it's demonstrably off the straight route. Belle then was in a direct line from Rio to the source of a radio direction signal. 50 miles back, where the big amphibian had crashed, he was in the same airline. To extend that line onto the interior would give the destination of Ribiera and the location of the headquarters where direct communication with the master was maintained. He worked busily. His maps were in separate sheets, and it took time to check the line from Rio. When he'd finished, he computed grimly. 100 miles an hour. He was busy figuring the maximum distance which could plausibly be accepted as a day's journey by air, and surveyed the maps again. The plateau of Kye&I, I'd guess. Fleets of aircraft could practice there and never be seen. An army could be maneuvered without being reported. Certainly the headquarters for the whole continent could be there. Striking distance of Rio, Montevideo, Buenos Aires, La Paz, and Anuncion, 5 republics. Certainly from his figures, anyway, it seemed plausible that somewhere up on the plateau of Kye&I, where no trails run, no boats ply, and no telegraph line penetrates, which juts out ultimately into that unknown region where the Rio Xingu and the Tapajos have their origins. Certainly it seemed plausible that there must lie the headquarters of the whole ghastly conspiracy. There, it might be, the deadly plants from which the master's poison brood were grown. There the deadly stuff was measured out and mixed with its temporary antidote. Paula came back, this time a young man with her. Her eyes were wide and staring, as if she'd looked upon something vastly worse than death. Ribiera, my uncle, he owned this place. They have him here, alive and mad, and all the rest. Belle fumbled in the pocket of his flying suit. The young man with Paula was looking carefully at the plane. There was a revolver in the holster at his side. An air of grim and desperate doggedness was upon him. "This is my cousin. He and his wife and—" The young man took out his weapon and fired. There was a clanging of metal and the screech of tortured steel. The screech of tortured steel. Steel, yes. Steel definitely has an H in it. There was a clanging of metal and the screech of tortured steel. Belle's own revolver went off a fraction of a second too late. "You may kill me, senor," said the young man through stiff lips. His revolver had dropped from limp fingers, and he pressed the fingers of his left hand upon the place where the blood welled out, just above his right elbow. "You may kill me. But if you and my cousin Paula escape, I have a wife, senor, and my mother and my children. Kill me if you please, it's your right, but I've seen my father go mad." A sweat of agony and of shame came out upon his face. "I fought him, senor, to save the lives of all the rest. And I've spoiled your engine. I've already sent word that you and Paula are here. Not for my own life, but—" He waited, haggard and ashamed and desperate, and hopeless. But Belle was staring at the motor of the airplane. Crankcase punctured. Aluminum, the bullet went right through. We can't fly 5 miles. And Ribiera knows we're here, or at least he will. Also, you might note that I didn't tweet out the fact that we'd started. That's because I'm going to let folks know that we started once I'm done with this story, hopefully. I'm going to double check whether this story ends in a timely manner. 10. Okay, we've got 2 chapters. Oop. Yeah, we've got 2 chapters. And it's not too far. So we'll just finish up the words. We'll finish up the last 2 chapters of this, and hopefully that's all with this story, because I'm not exactly a fan of it. But we'll finish up these last 2 chapters, and then I will tell the public, at least the folks who don't follow me on Twitch, that, hey, we're streaming, please come by and say hello. Just a moment, let me see if I can... Hi, are you gonna work? Yeah, okay. Sorry, I just had to make sure something was working. Anyway, Chapter 9. There was the sound of weeping in the house, the gusty and hopeless weeping of women. Bell had been walking around and around the plane, staring at it with his hands clenched, and Paula watched him. I'm thinking that you said that I must not despair without your permission, but... Hush. Bell stared at the engine. I'd give a lot for a car. Bolts, how many hours have we? 4, perhaps 5. You've smashed the radio in the house? Bell nodded impatiently. He'd smashed the radio, a marvelously compact and foolproof outfit, arbitrarily tuned to a fixed shortwave length. It was almost as simple to operate as a telephone. There had been no opposition to the destruction. Paula's cousin had disabled their plane and reported their presence. He was inside the house now, sick with shame, and yet he would do the same again. In one of the rooms of the house, behind strong bars, a man was kept who had been an object lesson. Is there any machinery at all about the place? Paula shook her head. It may be that there's a pump. Bell went off savagely, hunting it. He came back and dove into the cockpit of the plane, and came out with a wrench, and his jaws set grimly. He worked desperately at the pump, and came back with 2 short, thick bolts. He crawled into the plane again, tearing out the firewall impatiently, and got up under the motor. We've 1 chance in 5,000 of getting away from here to crash in the jungle. Personally, I prefer that to falling into Ribiera's hands. If your cousin or anybody else comes near us out here, call me, and I'll be much obliged. There was the sound of scraping, patient, desperate, wholly unpromising scraping, and it seemed to go on for hours. The wrench, please, Paula. She passed it to him. The bullet had entered the aluminum crankcase of the motor and pierced it through. By some special providence, it hadn't struck the crankshaft and had partly penetrated the crankcase on the other side. Bell had cut it out, first of all. He had 2 holes in the crankcase, then, through which the cylinder oil had drained away. And of all pieces of machinery upon Earth, an aircraft motor requires oil. Bell's scraping had been to change the punctured holes of the bullet into cone-shaped bores. The aluminum alloy was harder than pure aluminum, of course, but he'd managed it with a knife. And now he fitted the short bolts in the bores, forced the threads on them to cut their own grooves, and by main strength screwed them into a fit and tightened them. He came out with eyes glowing oddly. The vibration may work them loose, sooner or later, and they're not exactly oil-tight. And the crankshaft may clear them, and it may not. If we go up in the ship in this state, we may get 5 miles away or 500. At any minute it may fail us. And sooner or later it will fail us. Are you game to go up, Paula? She smiled at him. With you? Of course. He began to brush off his hands. There ought to be oil and gas here. Another thing. There'll probably be some metal chips in the crankcase, which may stop an oil line at any minute. It's almost like a form of... Well... He went off, hunting savagely for the supplies of fuel and lubricant which would be stored at any emergency field. He found them and was pouring gasoline into the tanks before what he was doing was noticed. Then there was stunned amazement in the house. When he had the crankcase full of oil, the young man came out and Bell tapped his revolver suggestively. With no man about this house, Ribiera will put one in of his own choice. And you have a wife and children. They'll be at that man's mercy. Don't make me kill you. Ribiera may not blame you for my escape if you tell him everything. And you're hurt anyway. Either we get away and you do that, or you're killed and we get away anyhow. He toppled 2 last 5-gallon tins of gasoline into the cockpits, crowding them abominably, and swung on the prop. The engine caught, and Bell throttled it down, kicking away the stones with which he had blocked its wheels, and climbed up into the pilot's cockpit. With his revolver ready in his lap, he taxied slowly over to a favorable starting point. The ship rose slowly and headed west again. At 3,000 feet, he cut out the motor to shout to Paula. One place is as good to another as us now. The whole continent's closed to us by now. I'm going to try and find that headquarters and do some damage. Afterwards, we'll see. He cut in the motor again and flew steadily westward. He rose gradually to 4,000 feet, 5, and watched his instruments grimly, the motor temperature especially. There were flakes of metal in the oil lines. Twice he saw the motor temperature rise to a point that brought sweat out on his face. But twice he saw it drop again. Bits of shattered metal were in the oiling system, and they had partly blocked the stream of lubricant until the engine had heated badly. But each time the vibration had shifted them or loosened them. They left the big amphibian no earlier than 9 o'clock. It was noon when they took off for the fazenda of Paula's kin, but it was 5 o'clock and after when they rose from there with an engine which might run indefinitely and might stop at any second. Bell didn't really expect it to run for a long time. He had worked as much to cheat Ribiera the satisfaction of victory as in hopes of a real escape. But an hour had passed, and the motor still ran. It was consistently hotter than an aero engine should run, and twice it had gone up to a dangerous temperature. One other time it had gone up for a minute or more, as if the oiling system had failed altogether, but it still ran, and the sun was sinking toward the horizon, and the shadows were lengthening. Bell began to look almost hopefully for a clearing in which to land before the dark hours came. Then it was that he saw the planes that had been sent for him and for Paula. There were 3 of them, fast 2-seaters very much like the one he drove. They were droning eastward, with all cockpits filled from that enigmatic point in the west, and Bell had descended to investigate a barely passable stream when they saw him. The leader banked steeply and climbed upward toward him. The others gazed, swung sharply, and came after him, spreading out as they came. And Bell, after one instant's grim debate, went into a maple leaf dive for the jungle below him. The others dived madly in its wake, and he heard a sharp, tearing rattle. It was a machine gun. He saw the streaks of tracers going very wide. Gunfire in the air is far from accurate. A machine gun burst from 100 yards when the gun is to be aimed by turning the whole madly vibrating ship is less accurate than a rifle at 600 or even 8. Most aircraft duels are settled at distances of less than 100 yards. It was that fact that Bell counted on. With a motor that might go dead at any instant, and a load of passengers and gas at least equaling any of the other ships, mere flight promised little. The other ships, too, were armed, at any rate the leader was, and Bell had only small arms at his disposal. But a plane pilot, stunting madly to dodge tracer bullets, has little time to spare for revolver work. Bell had but one advantage. He expected to be killed. He looked upon Paula and himself as very probably dead anyway, and he infinitely preferred the clean death of a crash to either the life or death that Ribiera would offer them. He flattened out barely 20 yards above the waving branches that are the roof of the jungle. He went scudding over the treetops, rising where the jungle rose, dipping where it dropped, and behind him the foliage waved madly, as if in a cyclone. The other planes dared not follow. To dive upon him meant too much chance of a dash into the entrapping branches. One plane indeed did try it, and Bell scudded lower and lower until the wheels of the small plane were spinning from occasional, breathtaking contacts with the feathery topmost branches of jungle giants. The other plane flattened out not 100 feet farther up, and 300 yards behind. To fire on him with a fixed gun meant a dive to bring the gun muzzle down, and a dive meant a crash. A stream flashed past below. There was the glitter of water reflecting the graying sky. A downward current here dragged at the wings of the plane, and Belle jerked the stick and her nose came up. There was a clashing, despite her climbing angle, of branches upon the running gear, but she broke through and shot upward, trying to stall. Belle flung her down again into his mad careering. It wasn't exactly safe, of course. It was practically death-defying, but Belle had not death, but life to fear. He could afford to be far more reckless than any man who desired to live. The plane went scuttling madly across the jungle tops, now rising to skim the top of a monster ceiba, now dipping deliberately. The three pursuing planes hung on above him helplessly, while the short twilight of the tropics fell, and Belle went racing across the jungle, never 20 feet above the treetop, and with the boughs behind him, showing all the agitation of a miniature hurricane. As darkness deepened, the race became more suicidal still, and there were no lighted fields nearby to mark a landing place. But as darkness grew more intense, Belle could dare to rise to 50, then 100 feet above the tops, and the dangers of diving to his level remained undiminished. And then it was dark. Belle climbed to 200 feet, 250. With more freedom now, he could take one hand from the controls. He could feel the menace of the tumultuously rolling motors in his wake, but he was smiling very strangely in the blackness. He reached inside his flying suit and tore away the front of his shirt. He reached down and battered in the top of one of the 5-gallon gasoline tins with the barrel of his revolver. He stuffed the scrap of cloth into the rent, and it was wetted instantly by the splashing. Another savage blow, unheard in the thunder of the motor. In the peculiarly calm air of the cockpit, the reek of gasoline was strong, but cleared away. And Belle, with the frosty, grim smile of a man who gambles with his life, struck a light. The cloth flared wildly, and he reached his hands into the flame and heaved the tin of fuel overside. The cloth was burning fiercely and spilled gasoline caught in midair. A fierce and savage flame dropped earthward. Spark on the cloth, and that cloud of inflammable vapor that formed where the leaking tin fell plummet-like, carried the flame down when the wind of its fall would have blown it out. The following planes saw a flash of light. They saw a swiftly descending conflagration. Tracing its... Once more. They saw a swiftly descending conflagration, tracing a steep arch toward the treetops. They saw that flaming vanish among the trees, and then they saw a vast upflaring of the fire below. Flames licked upward almost to the treetops, and Belle looked back from 2,000 feet. Wingtip lights were on below, and discs of illumination played upon the roof of the jungle above the fire. The three planes were hovering over the spot, but a thick, dense column of smoke was rising now. Green things shriveling in the heat and dried and rotted underbrush. Altogether, the volume of smoke and flame was very convincing evidence that an airplane had burst into flame in midair and crashed through the jungle top to burn to ashes beneath. But Belle climbed steadily to 5,000 feet. He cut out the motor, and there, in the shrieking and whistling of wind, as the plane went into a shallow glide, he spoke sharply. Paula. I'm all right. What now? There's a seat pack under you. It's a parachute. You'd better put it on. Heaven only knows when we land, but if this motor stops, we'll jump together. I think we'll have to jump just before dawn. This plane won't fly indefinitely. There's a 1 chance in a million that I know of. There'll be a moon before long. When it comes up, look for the glitter of the moonlight on water. With the wingtip lights we may manage to get down. But I doubt it. He moved his hand to cut in the motor again, and she stopped him. If we head south, we may reach Paraguay. It's perhaps 200 miles, but it's broad. We should see it, perhaps even the stars. Good work. Nils desperandum. That's our motto, Paula. He swung off his course and headed south. He was flying high now, and a logical and incomprehensible hope came to him. There was no hope, of course. He had had more than once a despairing conviction that the utmost result of all his efforts would be but the delaying of their final enslavement to the master, whose apparent impersonality made him more terrible the more he remained mysterious. So far, they seemed like struggling flies in a colossal web, freeing themselves from one snaring spot to blunder helplessly into another. But the moon came up presently, rounded and nearly full. The sky took on a new radiance, and the jungle below them was made darker and more horrible by the contrast. And when there were broad strips of moonlit foliage rising on the thin slopes beneath, Bill felt the engines faltering. He switched on the instrument board light. One glance, and he was told it was all over. There were where was I? I completely lost my space. But the moon came up presently, rounded and nearly full. The sky took on new radiance, and the jungle below them was made darker and more horrible by contrast. And when there were broad stretches of moonlit foliage visible on the rising slopes beneath, Bell felt the engine faltering. He turned on the instrument board, and one glance was all it took. He was cold all over. The motor was hot, hotter than it had ever been. The oil lines, perhaps the pump itself. Paula's hands reached back into the glow of the instrument board, and he leaned over and saw her pointing, moonlight on rolling water, far below. He dove for it steeply. The wing lights went on. Faint discs of light appeared far below, sweeping to and fro with the swaying of the plane, bobbing back and forth. It seemed to Bell that there had been nothing quite as horrible as the next minute or two. He felt the overheated, maltreated motor laboring. It was being ruined, of course, and a ruined motor meant they were marooned in the jungle. But if it kept going only until they landed, and if it didn't... White water showed below in the discs of the landing lights' glow. It tumbled down a swift and deadly radual, a rapid, and then deep black water, moving swiftly between tall cliffs of trees. Bell risked everything to bank about and land toward the white water. The little plane seemed to be sinking into a canyon as the trees rose overhead him on either side. But the moonlit rapid gave him his height, approximately, and the lights helped more than a little. He landed with a terrific crash. The plane teetered on the very verge of a dive beneath the surface. Bell jerked back the stick and killed the engine, and it settled back. A vast, colossal silence succeeded the deafening noise of 12 cylinders exploding continuously. There were little hissing sounds as the motor cooled. There was the smell of burnt oil. Are you all right, Paula? I'm all right. The plane was drifting backward now. It spun around in a stately fashion. Its tail caught in underbrush, and it swung back. It drifted past cliffs of darkness for a long time and grounded presently with surprising gentleness. Do you know, this sort of thing is getting monotonous. I think our motor's ruined. I never knew before that misfortunes could grow. That our misfortunes could grow anything. That I'd been expecting to be killed any minute since we started off, but the idea of being stuck in the jungle with a perfectly good plane and a bad motor. He fished inside his flying suit and extracted a cigarette, then lit it. Yeah, we haven't had a thing to eat, have we? There was a little slapping noise. Bell became suddenly aware of a horde of insects swarming around him. Smoke served partially to drive them off. Look here, we could unfold a parachute and cover the cockpits for some protection against these infernal things that are biting me. We may need the parachute. Does the smoke of yours drive him away? A little. I say, it would be crowded, but if I came up there, you here... I'll come back there. The extra cans of gasoline here. She slipped over the partition, and the odd flying suit would look so much more odd when a girl wears it. She settled down beside him, and he tried painstakingly to envelop her in a cloud of tobacco smoke. The plague of insects at least lessened. There was nothing to do but wait for dawn. She was very quiet, but as the moon rose higher, he saw that her eyes were open. The night noises of the jungle all about them came to their ears, furtive little slitherings, and the sound of things drinking greedily at the water's edge, and once or twice peculiar little despairing small animal cries off in the distance. The jungle was dark and sinister, and all the more so when the moon rose high and lightened its face, and left them looking into weird abysmal blackness between moonlit branches. Bell thought busily, trying not to become too conscious of the small body beside him. He moved suddenly and found her fingers closed tightly on the sleeve of his flying suit. Frightened, Paula? Don't be. We'll make it out of here. She shook her head and looked up at him, drawing away as if to scan his face more closely. I'm thinking of biology. I wonder. Bell waited. He felt an intolerable strain in her tensed figure, and he put his hand comfortingly over hers. And astoundingly he found it trembling. Are all women fools? Are we all imbeciles? She demanded, and continued to babble for a little while in a desperate cynicism. Bell's pulse pounded suddenly, and he smiled. Not unless men are imbeciles, too. To be fair. We've been through a lot in the last 2 days. It's natural that we should like each other. We've worked together rather well. His smile was a distinctly wry and uncomfortable one. I've been the more anxious to get to some civilized place where the master hasn't a deputy because, it wouldn't be fair to talk about, my feelings for you while you had no choice but to listen. She stared at him there in the moonlight, with the jungle moving about its business of life and death about them. And very, very slowly, the tenseness left her figure, and just as slowly she smiled. Perhaps you're lying to me, Charles. Perhaps. But it's a very honorable thing for you to say. I'm not ashamed now of feeling that I wish to be near you. Hush. Bell put his arm around her shoulder and drew her closer to him, where he tilted her face upward. It was oval and quite irresistibly pretty. I love you. I've been fighting it since, heaven knows, and I'm going to keep on fighting it, and it's no use. I'm going to keep on loving you until I die. Her fingers closed tightly upon his, and Bell kissed her. Now go to sleep. He pressed her head upon his shoulder and kept it there. After a long time, she slept, He stirred much later, and she opened her eyes again. "What is it?"
"These mosquitoes, I can't keep them off your face."
Chapter 10. For 4 hours after sunrise, Bell worked desperately. With the few and inadequate tools in the plane, he took apart the oiling system of the motor. It was in duplicate, of course, like all modern air engines. There were 3 magnetos and double spark plugs. Bell drained the crankcase beneath a sun that grew more and more hot and blistering, catching the oil in a gasoline can that he was able to empty into the main tanks. He washed out innumerable small oil pipes with gasoline and flushed out the crankcase itself, and had at the end of his working as many small scraps of metal as would half fill a thimble. He showed them then to Paula.
"And the stars in their courses fought against Sisera. Any one of these caught in just the right place would have led us down to that jungle last night."
"But they didn't."
"No. God loves the Irish. What's that thing?"
Paula was fishing, sitting on a fallen tree in the cloud of smoke from a smudge fire Bell had built for her. She was wearing the oily flying suit he'd found in the shed with the plane, and had torn strips from her discarded dress to make a fishing line. The hook was made out of the stiff wire handle of one of the extra gasoline tins. He was pointing to a flat-bodied fish with incredible jaws that lay on the grass, emitting strange sounds even in the air. It flapped about madly, and its jaws closed upon a stick nearly a half-inch thick, and cut it through. "It's a piranha, the same fish that bit your hand. It can bite through a copper wire fastened to a hook, but this hook is so long."
"How pleasant."
Something large and red passed before his eyes, and he struck at it instinctively. "Don't."
"Why?"
"It's a maribundi wasp, and its sting, well, children have died of it. A strong man will be ill for days from one single sting."
"Still more pleasant. The jungle's a charming place, isn't it? Any more little pets about?" "Metal Gear."
I'm sorry, I needed to make fun of that voice. That's all I can think of while I'm doing this voice is just Metal Gear. Anyway, now that I've made fun of myself. She looked about seriously. "There. The Palo Santo yonder has a hollow trunk, and in it there are usually ants, called fire ants. They bite terribly. It feels like a drop of molten metal on your flesh, and it festers afterwards. There's a fly, the Bernie fly, which lays its eggs in living flesh. The maggot eats its way within. I don't know much about the jungle, but my father had a fazenda in Mato Grosso, and I was there as a child. The camaradas told me much about the jungle then." Belle winced and sat down beside her. She had Ribiera's pearl-handled automatic within easy reach, and she saw him looking at it. "I don't think there's any danger, but there are cururus, water snakes. They grow very large."
"And I asked you to fish. Stop it."
She hauled the line ashore with a flapping thing on the end of it. Belle took the fish off and regarded her catch moodily.
"I've been thinking that Ribiera suspects we're dead. I'd been envisioning ourselves as marooned, yes, but relatively safe as long as we were thought to be dead. And I'd thought that if we lived a sort of castaway existence for a few weeks, we'd be forgotten, would have a faint chance of getting out to civilization without being noticed, but this..." I'll stay anywhere or go anywhere with you." Belle's hand closed on her shoulder at this. "I believe it. And if you noticed, I'd been thinking of letting down the trade. I'd been thinking of not trying to fight the master any longer, but of only getting you to safety. In a sense, I was thinking of treason to my job and my government. I suspect we love each other rather much, Paula. I'd never have dreamed for anyone else. Go over to the plane and don't fish anymore. I'll rustle the food for both of us."
She stood up obediently and smiled at him. "Kill that piranha before you try and handle it." Belle battered the savage thing until it ceased to move. He picked it up then and sniffed the air. Paula had been in a cloud of acrid smoke. She couldn't have detected the taint in the air, he discovered. He went curiously, saw a broken branch overhead, and then saw something on the ground.
He came back to the plane presently, looking rather sick. "Give me one of the machetes, Paulo. We brought him, I think."
"What's the matter?"
He took the wide-bladed woods knife. "A man. He either fell or was thrown from somewhere high above. From a plane he was U.S. Secret Service. There's a badge in his clothes. Don't come."
He went heavily over to the spot beyond the smudge fire, and he worked there for half an hour. When he came back, there were earth stains on his hands and clothing, and he carried a very small brown package in his hand.
He had a report ready to send off. I read it. It's in code, of course, but in the trade.
He set to work savagely on the engine, reassembling it, and as he worked, he talked in savage, jerky sentences.
"The serviceman at Annuncion. One of the 7 who vanished. He'd learned more than we have. He was caught, poisoned of course, and pretended to surrender. Told a great deal that he shouldn't in order to convince the Master's deputy. The key men in nearly every republic in South America are in the Master's power. Paraguay belongs to him. Body and soul. Bolivia is actually his. Every man in the official class from the president down knows that he's got 2 weeks or less of sanity if the Master's deputy shuts down on him. And he knows that at the crook of the deputy's finger he'll be assassinated before then. If they run away, they'll go murder mad. If they stay, they have to obey him. It's hellish."
He stopped talking to make a fine adjustment, and then went on, somberly.
"Chile's not so bad off, but the deputy has thralls nearly everywhere. Ecuador, well, the president and half of Congress have been poisoned. The man I found was trying to get a sample of the poison for analysis. He'd learned it was unstable and wouldn't keep. The Master has to send fresh supplies constantly all over the continent. That accounts for the deputies remaining loyal. If the Master had reason to suspect them, he only had to stop their supply. They couldn't stock up on the deadly stuff for their own use. So they're as abjectly subject to the Master as their thralls are to them. No new thralls are to be made in Paraguay or Bolivia, except when necessary. It's believed that in 6 months the other republics will have every other influential man subjected. Every army officer, judge, politician, outstanding richman. Then, overnight, South America will become an empire, with that devil of a Master as its overlord."
He lifted one of the oil pumps in place and painstakingly tightened the bolts that held it.
"Picture it, beasts as viceroys already taking their pleasure. Caligulas, Neros on vice-regal thrones all over the continent. Every man who shows promise or shows sign of honor or courage or decency sent mad or killed or..."
Paulo was watching his face closely. "I think there's something worse." Bell was silent for a moment.
"For me it is. Before the Master dares to make his coup public, he must be sure there will be no foreign interference, so he must establish a deputy in Washington. Relatively few chosen men, completely enthralled, could hold back our government from any action. Leaders in Congress, members of the cabinet, working in the defense of the Master, because his defeat would mean their madness. He would demand no treason of them at first. He'd require simply that he should not be interfered with. But his plans include the appointment of deputies in the United States later on. I don't think he could subdue America. I don't think so. But he could, and I think he would. Send whole cities mad, and if you think of that..."
He was silent, and he worked. A long, long time later, he swung on the propeller and the motor caught. He throttled it down and watched it grimly. The motor warmed up to a normal temperature and stayed there.
"It'll run. Those 2 plugs in the crankcase might come out at any time, just like last time. I've tightened them a little. They'd worked a little bit looser from the vibration, but that serviceman was heading for Annuncion. He'd been found out. They'd probably shot him down in midair after he'd gotten away. His plane may be crashed anywhere in the jungle within a mile or so. And I've 2 bearings on the fazenda where Ribiera went now. One from Annuncion through here and one from Rio. I want to go back there tonight and dump burning gasoline on the buildings, to do enough damage to disorganize things a little. Then I'm going to try and make it to a seaport. We can stow away, perhaps." He shut off the motor. "We'll start at dusk. There will be lights there. The report says it's nearly a city of thralls. We want the darkness for our getaway." We have 3 hours. Let us cook and eat. You must keep up your strength. She said it in all seriousness, with the air of one whose entire confidence is merely solicitous. Belle, who knew of at least 3 excellent reasons why neither of them should survive until dawn. Belle looked at her strangely, and then grinned, then took her in his arms and kissed her, and she seemed to like it. And they lunched quite happily on piranha and pacu, which is smaller, and drank water, and for dessert had more piranha. The long afternoon wore slowly away. It was hot, and it soon grew blistering. Insects came in swarm and tormented them until Belle built a second and larger smudge fire, but they fastened upon his flesh when they went out of its smoke for more wood. They talked as well as they could for smoke, and looked at each other as well as they could for smarting eyes. It wasn't at all the conventional idea of a romantic conversation, but it was probably a good deal more honest than most, because they both knew quite well that their chance of life was small. A plane whose motor was precariously patched, flying over a jungle without hope of a safe landing. If that patched-up motor died, was bad enough, but with the 3 nearest nations subservient to the master whose deputy Ribiera was, and all those nations hunting them as soon as they were known to be yet alive, would it not be wise, Charles, just for us to try to escape ourselves and not try? Wise, perhaps, but I've got to strike a blow while I can. He was staring somberly at the little plain fast upon a mud bank, with a tall green jungle all about. The deputies and all their thralls have their lives hanging by a thread, the thread of a constant supply of the antidote to the poison that's administered with the antidote. The deputies, Ribiera for instance, don't realize that. Else they wouldn't dare do the things they do, but let them realize the thread can be broken, and what their thralls could do to them before they all went mad. You see, let them learn a blow has been struck at the center of the ghastly thing, and they'll be frightened. They'll be close to mutiny through sheer panic, and there may be slip-ups. It was vague, perhaps, but it was true. The subjection of the poisoned men and women was due not only to the terror of what would happen if they disobeyed the deputies, but to a belief that that thing would not happen if they did obey. If Belle could do enough damage to the fazenda, the master, to shake the second belief, he would have shaken the whole conspiracy. And a conspiracy that is not a complete success is often an utter failure. It was close to sunset when they heard a droning noise in the distance. Belle went swiftly to the cockpit of the plane and searched the sky. I don't see it, and it probably doesn't see us. We'll be all right, I suppose. But he was uneasy still. The droning noise grew to a maximum and slowly died away again. It diminished to a distant muttering. What say we get aloft now? We'll follow that thing home. It's going from Annuncion to the place that we want to find. This is on that route. Whoever's in it won't be looking behind, and it's close to darkness. Paula stood up. I'm ready, Charles. Belle swung out on the floats and tugged at the prop. The motor caught and roared steadily. While it was warming up, he stripped off the rest of his shirt and tore it into wide strips, and tied the rags in the handles of the gasoline tins in the 2 cockpits. For our bombs, he explained, smiling faintly. You'll want to wear your chute pack, Paula. You know how to work it? And we'll divide the guns into what shells we have and stick them in the flying suit pockets. He made her show him a dozen times that she knew how to pull out the ring that would cause the parachute to open. She climbed into the front cockpit and smiled down at him. He throttled down the motor to its lowest speed and shoved off from the mud bank. And then he clambered up while the plane moved slowly over the water, under the gentle pull of the slow-moving propeller. He bent over and kissed her. For luck. The next instant he settled down to the controls, glanced a last time at the instruments, and gave the motor the gun. The plane lifted soggily but steadily, and swept upstream toward the rolling water of the Raudal, which tumbled furiously about an obstacle half of stones. Hang on, let's try that again. The plane lifted soggily but steadily, and swept upstream toward the rolling water of the Raudal, which tumbled furiously about an obstacle half of stones and shallows and half of caught and rotting tree trunks. It rose steadily until the trees dropped away on either side, and the jungle spread out on every hand. It rose to 1,000 feet and went soaring through the air to the north, while Bell strained his eyes for the plain on ahead. It was 10 minutes or more before he sighted it, winging its way steadily into the misty distance above the jungle. Bell settled down to follow, and the engine roared valorously. For half an hour, Bell watched it anxiously, but it remained cool and always had ample power. Paula's head showed above the cockpit combing. Mostly she looked confidently ahead, but once or twice she turned about to smile at him. The sun seemed high when they rose from the water, but as it neared the horizon, its rate of descent seemed to increase. They had been in the air for no more than 3/4 of an hour when it was twice its own disk above the far distant hills. Almost immediately it seemed to have that distance, and then the lower limb of the blaring circle was sharply cut off by the hill crests, and the sun sank wearily to rest behind the edge of the world. It seemed as if a swift, chill breeze blew over the jungle in the warning of night. The trees became dark, a shadowy dusk filled the air, even up to where the plane flew thunderously on, and then quite abruptly stars were shining, and it was night. Bell remembered suddenly and switched on the radio as an experiment. The harsh, discordant dashes sounded in his ears through the roaring of the motor. A beam of short waves was being sent out from his destination. While he was on the direct path, the monotonous signals could be heard, and when they weakened or died, he would have left the way. But they continued, discordant and harsh and monotonous, while the last faint trace of an afterglow died away, and night was complete, a roof of many stars glittering overhead, and the jungle lay dark and deadly below him. For nearly half an hour or more, he kept on. Twice he switched on the instrument board light to glance at the motor temperature. The first time it appeared a little high, and the second time it was normal again, but there was little use in watching instruments. If the motor failed, there was no landing field to make for. A sudden, faint glow sprang into being many miles ahead. The pinkish glare of many, many lights turned on suddenly. As the plane thundered on, the glow grew brighter, an illuminated field for the convenience of the messengers who carried the poison for the master to all the nations to which were to be subjected. The glow went out as Bell was just able to extinguish the long rows of twinkling bulbs, and he saw the harsher, fiercer glow of floodlights. He reached forward and touched Paula's shoulder. Conversation was impossible over the motor's roar, and her hand reached up and pressed his. And then he saw other lights, bright lights as from houses, arc lights as from storage warehouses or something of the sort. A long, long row of lighted windows, which might be dormitories or perhaps sheds in which the master's enslaved secretaries kept the record of his victims. The earth flung back the roaring of the little plane's motor. Bell had but little time to act before other planes would dart upward to seek him out. He dove, and the wingtip landing lights went on, sending fierce glares downward. Twin discs of light appeared upon the earth. Sheds, houses, a long row of shacks as if for laborers, a drying field on which were spread out plants with their leaves turning brown, a wall about it. It's the stuff. He swept on, but there was jungle, only jungle. He banked steeply as the lights flicked off and on below, as once the wing-tip lights showed men running frantically 200 feet below. Then a stream of fire shot earthward, and Bell held up his hand and arm into the blast of the slipstream. It blew out the blaze that licked at his flesh. He stared down. The gas can had left a trailing stream of fluid behind it as it went spinning down to earth. All that stream of inflammable stuff was in flame. The can itself struck the earth and seemed to explode, and the trailing mass of fire was borne onward by the wind and lay across a row of thatched-roofed buildings. An incredible sheet of fire spread out, and the stuff in the drying yard was burning. Bell laughed shortly and flung over another of his flaming bombs, and another, and then the fourth. He climbed for the skies then, as the rectangles of light showed below, and planes were thrust out of their lighted hangars. 4 huge conflagrations had begun. 4 huge
conflagrations. There's definitely another L in there. Four huge conflagrations had begun. One was close by a monster-rounded tank, and Belle watched with glistening eyes as it crept closer. Suddenly, it seemed suddenly, but it must have been minutes later, flame rushed up the sides of that tank, and there was a sudden hollow boom, and fire was flung broadcast in a blazing, pouring flood.
"Their fuel tank,"
said Bell, his eyes gleaming in the ruddy light from below. He shut off his landing lights and went up steeply.
"I've played hell with them now."
1,000 feet up, 2,000, 2,500, and suddenly Bell felt cold all over. The instrument board. The motor was hot, burning. He shut it off before it could burst into flames, but he heard the squealing of tortured, unlubricated metal grinding to a stop. He leveled out, and it was strangely, terribly silent in the high darkness, despite the absence of roaring of the wind in the gliding plane. The absence of the motor roar was the thing that made it terrible. Paula, one of those plugs came out, I guess. The motor's dead. Ship's gonna crash. You ready with your parachute?" It was dark up there, save for the glare of the fires upon the undersurface of the wings. But he saw her hand, and carmined by that glare, upon the combing of the cockpit. A moment later, he saw her face, and she turned, light-dazzled, to smile back at him. "All right, Charles. I'm ready. Are you coming too?"
"I'm coming."
Below them was the city of the Master, set blazing by their doing. If their chutes were seen descending, and if they were not...
"Count 10 and pull out the ring. I'll be right after you."
He saw the slim little black-clad figure drop, plummet-like, and prayed in an agony of fear. Then a sudden blooming thing hid it from sight. Thick clouds of smoke lay over the lights and fires below. Bell stepped over the side and went hurtling down toward the earth in his own turn. Alright, so I'm going to take a real short break, because it's been an hour, and we usually take a break about an hour in, to, get some stretches in, maybe have a snack, cup of tea, something, whatever suits your fancy. So we will be right back, and afterwards we'll start in on our new story, The Cavern World by James P. Olson. Okay. The Cavern World by James P. Olson. Impossible. What sort of creatures could they be that they could live 2 miles beneath the surface of the earth? Surely, Asher, you're joking. R. Briggs Johns, mighty power back of Stan America Oil Corporation, looked at Blaine Asher closely, expecting to see the chief geologist and scientist of the company laugh. But Blaine Asher didn't laugh. Serious, his rather thin face grave as he leaned his tall, muscular body above a torsion machine he was adjusting, there was nothing to indicate he had the faintest idea of a joke. "Asher, you don't really mean that," and he took a nervous turn around the lab. "If such a wild thing were possible, what has that got to do with our trouble? You haven't led me on to spend $1 million drilling a 36-inch hole just so you could test a fantastic theory." "You know better than that." Asher wiped his hands and leaned against the table. Johns, looking into the cool gray eyes of the man before him, did know better. Asher was more than just a geologist or a scientist. He might be termed a master geometallurgist, but that's beside the point. Johns nodded and wiped beads of perspiration from his brow. "You say impossible, and you want to know how those creatures caused this field, the largest oil field in the world, to start going bone dry overnight. All right. Remember how you laughed when I told you that oil would someday be mined instead of pumped or flowed from the earth? You couldn't see how one central shaft could be sunk and then tunnels run back underneath the oil strata, tapping the sand from the bottom and let the oil run down to be pumped out into one shaft? And yet, in that way, we would get all the oil instead of the possible 1/8 of the total amount as we get by present methods. You've seen that done, and you said that was impossible." "Yes, but those test wells we mined were only a few hundred feet deep. Wells in this field are 8,000 feet deep. Think of the heat, man. You can't do it, and as for people, your great field
has suddenly gone dry almost in a month's time. What's happening here can happen elsewhere. Only formations in this field are more suited to there being life, or perhaps something else, below us. State America's going broke. Many others have already gone broke. Still, that oil couldn't have gotten far away. As for heat, yes, we know that oil's hot when it comes up from the oil sand at 8,000 feet, or from ordinary wells at 3,000 to 6,000 feet, but... At this, Asher lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. Gas coming out of the same well is cold. So cold it forms frost, inches thick on pipes and tanks. Rock pressure. Rock pressure. The pressure of the earth forcing up the gas causes that. Why couldn't that same pressure cool great caverns? I can't tell who's talking here. Dang. Rock pressure. The same pressure of the earth forcing up the gas causes that. Why couldn't that same pressure cool great caverns below the granite cap, below the oil sands? It could. For that matter, I know that the same pressure will generate useful power. I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, can I nitpick for a second? If you're going to have people talking, like, back and forth, and you're not going to put dialogue like markers, like character X said, character Y said. Like, I don't do that sometimes because I want to just dialogue. Don't close your quotation and then open a new quotation if it's the same person talking. Oh my goodness, that is a pet peeve. Because, like, that's the open-close quotation, to me, is what signifies this person starts talking here and ends talking here. So, if you close the quotation, I'm going to assume someone else is speaking, but then later, if I go read it and there's, like, context says that it's the same person saying the same thing, same person speaking with both of those statements, like, put a character delineator at the end or something. Ugh. Anyway, I shouldn't dunk on these too badly. They're from the 1920s. They probably cared about writing in a much different way than we did. Alright, say then you work down there, nearly 2 miles underground. Granted that we can tunnel from beneath the sands and pump more oil from one central shaft than we do now from 50 wells. What has this got to do with the tosh about a race of people? They're not people, perhaps. Asher grinned at the look on John's face. Let's say rather creatures. Have you met Li Wang, the great Chinese scientist, or his Russian geological collaborator, Krensky? No? Well, I have. I met them in Paris in 1935, 5 years ago. They're brilliant men, and they've prepared some wonderful papers. Brilliant, I said. They're also dangerous. They claim, you know, that the fossils we now drill up come from a lost race. People who went into the earth while man, like us, was coming up onto the earth from water. Some claim these fossils have been on the surface at one time and were silted over. But 8,000 feet's a lot of silt, Johns. You've ever thought of that? Good heavens, you almost make me believe you were right. But supposing there is such a race of things, what do you do? This. Asher drew back the curtain that was stretched across one end of the laboratory. You know I was working on a cage in which to descend into that 8,000-foot well you've drilled, the well you're going to use to try and find why this field is suddenly dry. Well, this is it. John stared, shook his head wonderingly, and then stared again. Before him, ready to be transported to the well that was larger than any had ever drilled before, was what Blaine Asher had called his miner, for want of a better name. It was a thick steel tube, 12 feet long and large enough around that a man might stand inside of it. The top was welded on in much the manner a top is welded on an ordinary hot water heater, and had connections for a hose in it. At the height of a man's eyes, heavy windows were set in, and in one side was a door just large enough to admit a man's body. This door sealed tight the minute it closed. It looks like some sort of deep-sea diving outfit, John said as he walked around the braces that held the miner upright. But all those gadgets inside and on the bottom... He indicated the strange instruments that could be seen when the door was opened, and the strange glass tubes that projected from the very bottom. They're pressure power units, my own invention. For 10 years I've been working on this. I knew that someday I'd want to explore the oil caverns beneath the earth, so I made ready. As I told you, rock pressure or earth pressure isn't a tremendous thing.
It is power, so I figured out how to use it. Under artificial pressure, I've tried out my miner and its equipment. Those tubes sticking from the bottom contain something you're familiar with. Non-burning and non-explosive helium gas. I've discovered a way by their use to create power that'll melt away rock or iron, literally dissolve it into nothing. Not an hour or minutes, in seconds, Johns. The pressure of the earth acts as my generator. The pressure action on the filaments of platinum and several compositions which I have no time to explain now cause heat. Call it friction of compressed air, if you wish. As neon gases carry an electric spark, so does this helium carry the power generated by the earth pressure. The pressure below Earth acts on the delicate coils and points of my generator. This bit of power is carried into the helium tubes, and by a system of vacuum power, is increased by millions of times. And thus, the tiny spark of a cigar lighter would electrocute 100 men.
Oh heck, someone just showed up in chat. Nice. Thank you for the follow, Matt Hatter. Nice. Where was I? Oh, the pressure of the earth. You mean something like a violet ray is increased in the lightning tubes? John strove to grasp the foundation of the thing.
Yes,
that's not the right voice.
Yes, the foundation of it all, with the Earth's pressure, is the power motive. So, after my miner is on the bottom of the well, I can burn, or dissolve, a room as large as this laboratory in a few minutes. The whole thing is no mystery after you learn it. Not nearly so much as radium or radio was. Merely creating a spark of electricity and fanning it through a vacuum in a conductor of manned gases.
But Johns had unconsciously dropped his voice to a whisper. What are these strange creatures? How would you deal with them? Asher, I'm beginning to think I believe in this nutty idea of yours, and any man who can generate power with that pressure of air that's packed by Earth must know what he's on about.
I have but one protection against anything down there that tries to harm me. That is this, see?
What he held up looked like an old-fashioned six-shooter. It was fitted with a platinum-sealed box in the place where a cylinder would have been. The barrel looked like some strange blue glass.
Do you see that test tube?
Asher pointed to a glass tube on the table a few feet away.
Now watch.
He pressed the tiny ratchet under his thumb, and a snapping, buzzing noise filled the laboratory. Johns gave an exclamation of wonder and awe, and quickly the test tube started to melt into a pool of molten glass. Asher increased the pressure of his ratchet trigger, and the tube was knocked to the floor.
Static electricity, always some form of electricity,
said Asher, grinning at the astonished oil baron.
Conductor coils here,
he continued as he tapped the sealed cylinder,
are charged as much as a flash lamp battery. The charged conductors attract the static electricity of the air, and in a manner similar to the action of the power generator, increase power. There's a slight difference. By turning down quick power on my static gun, I can cause the charge to knock down and merely electrocute, as I knocked the half-melted tube from the table.
So they're kind of like the Teslas from Warehouse 13. Okay. I mean, broadly. They don't work... functionally they would work on a similar principle. They're just calibrated differently to be more or less deadly. And I can understand that a little. John sighed profoundly. It's the same juice that causes a gasoline truck to catch fire if you don't have a ground chain on it somewhere, but just the same, I claim it's remarkable.
Not half as remarkable as what I expect to find 2 miles down when I descend tomorrow.
Asher had found a dreamy look in his eyes.
I wonder, new ways to get petroleum wealth, strange people? Men.
Asher, a tight-fitting asbestos composition suit covering him from foot to neck, spoke tersely.
When you get beyond bottom, stop every bit of machinery and don't dare pull me up until I give the signal. If I'm down there the entire day, all right, but if I don't signal within 36 hours, pull up anyhow.
He smiled, trying to make light of the danger. From the bull wheels of the drilling rig, Asher spooled out some of the air hose cable, through which air blown over ice would be pumped into the miner, and when the long steel cylinder was over the hole and ready,
He turned to the company officials and government scientists and engineers around him in the boarded-up derrick.
Possibly I can get a survey in an hour. Perhaps I'll have to come back to the surface and make adjustments to my equipment. That remains to be seen. Now, let's get low.
He adjusted a helmet over his head. It looked much like the helmet worn by a sea diver, except that it had no connecting hose for air. The windows on the helmet, which contained pressure lights, worked on the same principle as the disintegrating rays of the miner. When Asher turned the ratchet that set off the little pressure machine into motion, a violet-tinged green ray of great lightning power shot out and increased by weight of air, or atmosphere beneath the earth, the power of one tiny spark 1,000,000 times. Without ceremony or farewell, Asher crawled inside his tube. The door was closed and he fastened it from the inside. For a moment a wild panic assailed him, but he fought it off, becoming again less the feeling human and more the cold calculator of advanced science. The light from outside, coming in through the windows of the miner, was shut off. The long steel cage clanked against the sides of the special casing in the well, and Blaine Asher was on his trip into a lower world never before visited by man. At least, that was what Asher believed. But he'd known what had waited for him, 2 miles into the bowels of the earth. Just a moment, I need to check something. I'm curious what a certain particular thing looks like. Oh, I'll keep going while it loads. At 500 feet, the descent stopped, giving him time to adjust himself to the pressure change. The gas and oil had been eased out of the hole. That is, the casing had been run on through the producing strata, shutting it off. Asher signaled by buzzer, and a stream of the ice-washed air flowed down to him. 3,000 feet, 6,000 feet, more than a mile down. Sweat poured from his body in streams, and the air coming into the miner through the hose did not relieve him. It was hot, almost unbearably so. His ears were roaring. The dark of his tube was relieved as he turned on his pressure lamps. He adjusted the pressure discs over his ears by twisting a thumbscrew on his helmet, and the pounding of his eardrums ceased. Gasping, he watched the depth meter in front of him. It didn't seem as if he was moving, but the indicator now showed more than 7,000 feet. It moved around more slowly and more slowly, trembled at 8,000, and then stopped. Like the snapping of a man's fingers, the temperature inside the miner changed. Asher was now 50 feet below the bottom of the oil and gas sands, and if his theory about rock pressure worked, it was working. Frost was forming on the inside of the miner. I'm right. Right. Asher thought, elated, sending his buzzer signal up to those so far above. The icy air through his hose changed to air of normal temperature, and he signaled for a slack in the lowering cable, and then prepared for the greatest test of all. Cramped, with hardly room to move, he studied his cages. Helium tubes at the proper pressure for compressing the tiny spark of the pressure generator, so it would flare 1,000,000 times stronger under the action of the vacuum tubes. Diamond and cut glass tubes in the bottom of the miner, thermoed with layers of quicksilver. Everything cleared, everything ready. His hand shaking, Asher pushed the tiny switch that brought his filament points trembling together under the atmospheric pressure so far underground. A tiny spark danced and throbbed through the tiny glass tube before him, beginning to buzz as it started the circuit of increasing coils, and soon humming and vibrating as the helium and vacuum tubes swelled it to full power. Spark after spark, increased almost beyond imagination, followed one after another. The miner throbbed and shook. White-faced, Asher touched the little lever that opened the blasting outlets in the bottom. Almost instantly, the miner dropped a full 6 inches, went on down to a foot. Asher, I speak English, I promise. Asher, pride of success choking him, pulled the lever hard over, which brought some of the tubes beneath him, spreading out, to blast away the earth on each side of him. He signaled for more and more slack, as the depth indicator showed he'd burned or disintegrated his way down to 30 feet beyond the original bottom of the hole. He was now below the bottom of the protecting wall of casing now, at the mercy of the pressure of 2 miles of earth. Slowly, setting all his bottom tubes to cutting away on all sides of him, he started hollowing out enough room to step out into. His lights, when he looked through the windows, showed ghostly on earth, 10 feet on each side of him. 10 more minutes and he'd created a room nearly 25 feet square, a man-made cave 2 miles beneath the surface. There was something akin to awe in the feelings of Asher when he opened the little door, crawled out, and stood erect. The pressure lamps in his helmet lit up the room he'd made. There were no sounds, just a vague, ringing silence. Then, so quickly it robbed him of his senses, 2 things happened. 100 yards away from the well in which he descended, another well, drilled by another oil company, was shot, and 300 quarts of nitroglycerin was shot off in the hole. Asher screamed and clamped his ear discs down tight. It seemed the very gods of thunder were shrieking and raging in his head. Every nerve and fiber in his body throbbed and tingled with the hellish vibration. On his knees where the shock had thrown him, in darkness beyond description, Asher realized the lights from the miner no longer shone out. Frantically, he adjusted the small lights in his helmet and got them descending off their rays again. Then an icy hand seemed to squeeze his heart, turning his blood to ice water in his veins. He cursed himself for not foreseeing that some company might shoot a well close by while he was underground. He turned. The miner was all right, but Blaine Asher himself was trapped. For the walls of the hole below the bottom of the casing had caved. 30 feet of rock, sand, and conglomerate matter were between him and the bottom of the pipe. He was trapped, 2 miles below the earth. There was no hope of rescue, the hope that miners feel in deep shafts. There would be no rescue for Asher. No one could get to him. He cried out his horror, fighting to keep from swooning, and the helmet hampered him. He turned on a small pressure lamp attached to the belt at his waist, and chanced taking the helmet off. Dank and nauseous was the air he breathed, since it no longer came through the filters in his helmet, but it was air that would serve, nevertheless. A cracking, rumbling sound caused him to turn quickly. Eyes wide, he stared at the long crack that was opening before him. Asher was between 2 layers of granite, 1 layer under him and 1 layer above him, just below the oil sands. And now as the crack between these 2 layers widened, he could see it slope downward until it ended in a great cavern that stretched endlessly away beyond the beams of his light. It wasn't this crack that caused Blaine Asher, an iron-hearted man of science, to choke and sag down to a sitting position, his knees refusing to support him. No, it was the terrible, unbelievable things that scurried around in the smooth rock hall that stretched away into the cavern. Frozen with soul-chilling fear, Asher stared with eyes that bulged. What were they? Spawned neither of God nor Satan, what could they be? Black-skinned, or was it skin? Like rubber with round bodies, like black basketballs inflated to triple size, bodies that seemed to ripple, distort, and swell, contract, with life within life. Short, foot-long stems that must have been legs, ending in round balls that served as feet, no doubt. Tentacles, Asher would have called them, 6 feet in length, thick as mighty cables and dotted with suckers like the tentacles of an octopus. And heads. Asher gagged and vomited. Not heads, just masses of the black body substance as large as the 2 fists of a man. And each head was a crooked black gash for a mouth. There were no eyes that Asher could see, and yet these things seemed to see one another and emitted strange, chill, squeaking sounds. As Asher watched, the things sensed his presence, and 100 of them rose and started toward him. They didn't walk, but nor did they crawl. They undulated and contorted strangely, and came on with incredible speed, long tentacles waving before them, slithering on the rocky floor of the cavern, making those odd, squeaking noises. As they neared him, Asher sprang to his feet, backing up against the pile of cavings beside the miner. A long tentacle whipped out and wrapped around his leg, and a short snout tentacle quivered toward his face. There was strength beyond imagining in the grip on him. With an almost animal snarl, the man from the earth's surface moved to protect himself from these creatures, surely of the lowest living order. He grabbed into the pocket of his loose asbestos composition suit, and his fingers closed comfortingly around the static gun. He aimed it, and the thing gripping him was hurled back upon the others. Cracking, snapping viciously, the charges of electricity that were drawn from the very earth increased in the gun and spumed out like lightning bolts. The thing squeaked excitedly and surged forward, and Asher's finger pulled the ratchet trigger full force, and like dew before a strong shaft of sunlight, Asher's finger pulled the ratchet trigger full force, and like dew before a strong shaft of sunlight, the gruesome things were knocked away. Hating the sight, Asher changed the charge of his gun, cutting the size of the path the volts discovered, thereby increasing the potency that discharged. The piled-bodied sizzled, and to Asher's nose came a sulphurous smell, and then there was nothing at all. Sick, he put the gun back into the deep pocket and leaned on the wall. He turned around again to the pile of cavings that barred his way from the surface and dug like a madman with his bare hands. The miner was weighed down and he couldn't use it anyhow. The blasting tubes were on the bottom and they couldn't be shifted to the top. Suddenly he stopped his crazed work and raised his head and listened. My God, am I stark mad? He thought he must be, for the voice of a human being came to his ears. You'll be pleased, Blaine Azure, to turn around, and don't make any foolish moves, I warn you.
Li Kong! Krensky!
Asher turned face to face with the super scientists of whom he had spoken to R. Briggs Johns the day before. Asher shook his head. More of this terrible dream, this meeting of two humans down in the Earth's core. Most right, Honorable Asher. Li Wong bowed mockingly. He and Krensky were garbed in loose-fitting garments of much the same style as Asher. In their hands they carried static guns, not the small guns such as Asher had concealed in his pocket. More like heavy air drills they were. Asher frowned at the lamps they carried. He knew by the dazzling action of the rays that they were pressure lamps, but they gave off much better light than those of his own invention. They had gone him one better there.
Did you see them? And how did you get down here? Tell me.
He took a step toward Li Wong, intending to lay his hand on the Chinaman, to make sure he was live flesh and blood and not a figment of his disordered brain. Also, wow. That is a very outdated term. Yikes. Stand where you are, Li Wong snapped. He held the heavy static gun up, and Asher felt a light charge tingle across his body. Those things of which you speak, I assume you mean the Petriola. Yes, we see them. Every day we see them. For us they work. They work, my dear Blaine Asher, tapping upward into the oil sands. Sands that are burial places of countless millions of generations of Petriola, of lost races that once ruled supreme over these underground worlds. How simple to take the oil from below, the oil you want so much from above. Someone must do the work. I and Krensky found the Petriola ready and willing. Being creatures of feeling with a little sense, we were able to bend their dying wills to do our work. You see, we made them feel we could save them a dying race from extinction. They do our bidding. Asher was bewildered by the enormity of the thing.
You mean these things you call the Petriola actually work for you? That you save them from becoming extinct?
Exactly. Li Wong nodded, seeming to be enjoying himself. Like humans of the surface, Petriola live on the dead. I mean, wherever we get our living food from the earth, we plant our dead back in that earth. Petriola are spawned in beds of petroleum. Just as eels seek deep water to lay their eggs, so do Petriola go to the oil strata to spawn future tribes. When we pump out the oil, they have no, shall we say, hatching beds? But now, by tapping and bringing down the oil, we've assured them more spawning pits. They'll increase, and we've made them sense it. For that matter, the very oil they breed in gives them sustenance. That's why they're black-fleshed and blooded and have suckers instead of mouths. It's easy for us who are wiser than other men to figure what oil field might contain such people. We have a rapid elevator connecting us to the surface and...
Then I'm not trapped.
No? Li Wang wrinkled his forehead quizzically. You should realize we cannot allow you to go back to the surface, alive or any other way. We intend to increase the Petriola, spreading them to other underground yet uninhabited worlds. You'd spoil that. No, you'll never return to the surface. They cannot haul your tube to the top, so they think you perished in it. And it might have been better if you had, Mr.
I wouldn't.
And it might have been better if you had, Mr.
I wouldn't.
He snarled and rolled the ratchet of his static gun, and Ashlar was hurled to the floor by the heavy shock. Wisely, he stood up, keeping his hands well away from the pocket in which his own gun rested. He doubted whether his little static gun could compete with the guns of the others, but it was something. They'd not thought to search him, and perhaps they might not. It was his only hope. Li Wang bowed low again, motioning Asher to go ahead. Now you'll see what we've done. We're proud, and we know you can appreciate our workings. You'll be glad to learn why we're doing this. You'll be intrigued as a fellow scientist. Then, so sad to say, you must perish for having gained that very knowledge. Asher shrugged, and through half-closed lids he eyed Li Wang and the rather small, slender Krensky, of high brow and large head. Then he walked forward and ahead of them. Head up, shoulders back, he walked carelessly down the wide hall, a hall that led into the main cavern of that underground empire. It was large, fully 100 feet in a rough square. Not 15 feet from floor to ceiling at any point, it followed the course of the 2 layers of granite between which it was sandwiched. Other long halls or crevices ran in every direction out of this main cavern. In the walls and niches and cracks, the superior pressure lamps had been placed, throwing a bright, eerie light over it all. Asher recoiled suddenly at the sight of hundreds of Petrolia that swarmed the hallways, and they seemed to sense another presence beside that of Li Wang or Krensky. A choked, gurgling sound came from Wang, and they disappeared down the halls, squeaking angrily as they went. "In our control room," explained Li Wang, waving his hand about him. He pointed to a dozen 24-inch pipelines that ran along the low ceiling, coming from as many different halls into the room, but all going out to the same large hall, larger than the rest. And there are the arteries of our system. There's the oil that is so, shall we say strangely, missing in your wells. He smiled, a taunting, mocking light in his eyes. You well understand how we do it. Above us, just below the oil strata, is a steel trough-shaped roof. The oil, tapped from below, drains into these, and then into these pipelines. If we were working from above now, we would run it to a central shaft and pump it out, but we don't want it on the surface.
Then why in the name of hell do you want it?
Asher barked, a tense note of anger in his voice.
What do you do with it?
These 2 were human, at least they were in man form, if not in feeling. The Petrolia could be handled. Asher was getting mad and his fear ebbed. Come along. Li Wang led the way under the pipelines, down the large hall. Krensky's heavy static gun ready walked at Asher's back. They came out into another cavern that stretched beyond the powerful lights. The sound of their voices echoed like the thunder of the drums of Thor, and Asher realized the cavern might stretch away in Stygian blackness for hundreds of miles. Asher marveled, for the floor of this cavern dropped at least 5 feet below the level of the control room, or incoming hallways, forming a natural reservoir for the big streams of oil that were pouring into it from the pipelines. The rumble of oil as it came in and splashed out in a never-ending stream, and the rumble of the oil streams above them as the precious fluid flowed down into the plated drain roof, sounded like the tramp of the weary feet of the damned, as it echoed back and forth across the mighty cavern. Our storage, Wang stood at the edge and explained, as you may see, a concentration incubator, or spawning bed and food storage for the Petrolia. Boy and Asher looked again at the rippling oil at his feet. He choked brokenly and stepped back a place. The oil near the bank was alive. It rippled and splashed, teeming with life, by the strange alchemy of breeding in oil and living on oil as man lives on bread. That lake of oil was a mass of growing petrolia, millions, perhaps countless billions of them. Hideous, foul things that would be turned loose with the rest on that nightmare world, that would be taken to other buried worlds to start new races.
But why?
Asher almost screamed the words at Li Wang. Petrolia will be our armies protecting our underground wealth. They will be our faithful workers under no command but mine. Even Krensky hasn't mastered the over-control it takes to handle them. Gradually, as happened to the field we're now under, all the oil fields will go dry. We'll be getting the oil from below and putting it in storage in Mother Earth. Think, Blaine Asher, what it'll mean. There was a fanatical light in Li Wang's eyes.
A world without petroleum is a world without power. No oil for fuel, no gasoline, lubricants, or byproducts of any sort. No airplanes could fly, tanks, tractors, oil-burning trains and ships. Mechanical appliances. Nothing could run. We take the oil from America now. But later, when your petroleum increased and you figured out how to move them, you're going to go to all oil-producing countries.
That's right. We'll secrete the oil and paralyze the world. Now in Russia, China, and India, our societies are organizing and growing. They'll be the handle of the weakened, powerless nations, and I'll be the ruler to the universe surface and beneath, with Krensky to aid me, you see. It's wonderful, is it not? And knowing what you do, having seen what you have, could you call it impossible?
Blaine Asher groaned. It wasn't impossible, he knew it. Unreal, monstrous, but never impossible. A region of hideous petrola, a world stripped of automotive and mechanical power, its fuel held in the hands of a few far underground. It was terrible to think of. And Asher, the only one who knew, the only one who could avert such a thing. The fate of an entire world was in his hands, and he would soon die. Die? No. Asher swore silently to himself that no power in existence should keep him from destroying these fields. Rather, no power in existence should keep him from destroying these two fiends. It had to be done. He dared not fail.
Wonderful, stupendous thing. I'd like to grasp the hand of the genius who devised and carried out such a wonderful thing.
He forced himself to smile, and took a step toward Li Wang, right hand extended, his left slipping toward the pocket where his own static gun rested. Wang extended his own right hand, but something in the chill, flint look of Asher's eyes must have warned him. Even as Asher's fingers closed around his hand, he tried to jerk back.
Destroy him!
He cried out to Krensky. Asher dropped to one knee, letting his static gun remain in his pocket. His left hand closed around Li Wang's wrist as the man tried to pull away. Krensky was bringing the heavy, cinder-like gun up and aiming it at Asher. Asher twisted on one knee, his teeth gritted, braced to receive the shock from the gun. He jerked Li Wang's arm down, heaved, and came to his feet. Crying out, arms and legs flailing, the man catapulted toward Krensky, and at the instant Krensky fired. The sickening smell of cindered flesh was in Asher's nostrils as he turned and ran back up the main hallway. He glanced back over his shoulder as he ran, and shuddered at the mass lying at Krensky's feet. Li Wang was no more. Wide-eyed, the Russian stared at the thing at his feet, then with a fiendish shriek turned and brought the gun into line on the fleeing Asher. A crackling charge of electricity singed the back of Asher's head as he dove head first around the corner of the hall into the control cavern. He reasoned that Krensky had sent a full charge after him, and hope kindled higher in his breast, for Asher believed his smaller static weapon was as strong as that of the other. At that, it would be a test, and Asher dared not take chances. He crouched in the door of another hallway, waiting. Cursing, Krensky dashed into the control cavern. Asher brought up his gun and fired, but even as he pulled the trigger, A long tentacle reached from the dark crevice behind him and jerked his arm. His charge snapped by the Russian, warning the other that Asher too was playing with powerful electric rays that meant death should they touch. Asher yielded to the tug of the slimy, sulfur-smelling tentacle, letting it pull him into the crevice, the charges of Krensky's weapon crackling by him, leaving his skin dry and a powdery sensation in his mouth. In the shelter of the crevice, Asher turned his gun upon the Petrolia that gripped him. The tentacles fell away, fading to nothingness before the charges that showed quivery blue in the dark. Like catacombs, one crevice opened into another. Asher darted into the next crevice and edged cautiously toward the control cavern. The angry buzzing and snapping of Krensky's weapon caused him to duck instinctively, although no deadly charges came his way. "Oh, God, they're coming in! They're coming in!" He heard the Russian's high-pitched voice, agonized and wailing. A squeaking and slithering, now greater than ever, rose above all other sounds, and Asher realized what Krensky meant. Lee Wong said that only he could control the Petrolia. They were swarming into the control room now. That was what Krensky was shooting at. The squeaking sounds came up the crevice in which Asher was, and a cold, clammy sweat broke out all over him. He could blast 1,000 of them into nothing, but by sheer force, more body than his light static could down, they would overwhelm him. His mind raced swiftly, and he remembered the location, out in the control room, of the cage elevator that ran to the surface. It had not been hurt by the glycerin blast that trapped Asher. The elevator shaft from the control room was cased into the cavern floor, and the blast had not jarred this far. He wheeled and sent another charge of static electricity into the crevice back of him, and then lunged out into the control room. It would be his own weapon against Krensky's, and chance to gain the bottom of the shaft. Krensky piled charred heaps of the Petrolia around him, which had momentarily cleared the attack, was running across the control room. Like a seething wave, the foul Petrolia undulated from every crevice and hallway, coming in to a fresh attack. The Russian, terror lending him speed, raced for the cage at the foot of the shaft that led out to the surface. At the same time, Asher ran out. Nearly 100 feet apart, on opposite sides of the cavern, they stopped. Krensky turned his heavy weapon toward Asher at the same time. Asher sent his own gun, crackling and snapping out blue, fiery flame. Sidestepping, now crouching, now dodging to this side and that, they fought their strange duel. Asher's right arm was burned, his hair was singed from his head, and his body jarred again and again as Krensky touched him. Krensky groaned through gritted teeth, and he had suffered burns all over his chest and left leg. As the Petrolia came on and the lightning play of deadly electric charges continued, Asher made a discovery. He noticed that the rays or charges of the two guns, when they met in midair, caused blue flame, and then the charge went no further. It did it again. The two charges met and crackled to an explosion in the air. Krensky too noticed it, and he also noticed that the Petrolia were almost upon them again, coming on in a wave that would not be hurled back. He looked straight at Asher and met the dare in his eyes. Straight at each other, neither moving, they shot their static charges. Neither would move. It was a challenge from Asher that Krensky had to meet. One of them would have to die before the other would be able to gain the cage in the shaft. There'd be no compromise. Only one man at a time could go surfaceward. If they continued to dodge and fight, the Petrolia would overwhelm them. Power against power, they fought it out. Asher's finger tightened on his trigger release until it seemed the skin would split. Then he caused his hand to tremble just enough to make his electric charges cover the space in which Krensky's charges traveled. Hissing, spitting, flashing explosions, giving off sounds and light like big explosions of flash powder. The charges met. Asher tingled from head to foot and thrilled to the very marvel of the thing. Two deadly beams of electricity, holding each other off. In one long, continuous flash, the contact point of the charges began to shift. Closer and closer as the force of the superior charges cleaved through the other, the contact points neared Krensky. He He saw death upon him, for in another instant Asher's charges would hurl his own boats back upon him. The smaller weapon of Blaine Asher, attracting more static electric currents by reason of having a small attracting battery inside, where the larger gun of the other depended upon magnets for attraction, was a triumphing. Krensky's mustache and light beard singed and curled, and he cried out, stepped back, and threw up his arm as death flashed through his body. Asher had his gun playing about him as he raced toward the big gates and valves that shut off the drain of the pipelines. Burning, reeking of sulfur and burned leather, the Petrolia vanished before him. But as he turned, the drainage system that was robbing the field shut off. They blocked his way again. There were too many to blast away altogether, and they pressed in. Asher leapt forward, feet kicking, left fist smashing out, static gun crackling as if to tell him that nothing could stop them. Tentacles gripped at him, the foul, stinking smell gagged him. But the squeaks of the Petrolia maddened him. Squeak, darn you. No, that's not his voice, you're right.
Squeak, damn you.
Asher shouted wildly, kicking, shouting, and hitting, gaining toward the shaft. Squeak!
For all the damned things that ever bred below the earth cannot stop one surface man.
He burned and fought his way through and jumped into the cage as his gun electrocuted two of the Petrolia that tried to weave in after him. As he slammed the door, Asher was conscious that something was happening. He hesitated, just long enough to see the cavern start buckling and caving. The pressure of the oil, now shut off, was filling back toward the surface, creating a mighty pressure downward. The surface wells would produce man's power fuel once more. Asher slammed the door, turned on the power, and the cage shot upward. Half an hour later, those waiting on the floor of the derrick above the hole in which Asher had gone down started. Asher, who was burned, wounded, blood streaming from his battered body, staggered in and collapsed at their feet. I can't believe it. It's insane. It's impossible. Yet every well in the field started producing again. When we went to that old abandoned wildcat well, we found the shaft opening. I had it covered up as you ordered. R. Briggs Johns paced up and down the laboratory floor, talking to Asher, who had just arisen from his bed, 2 weeks after he'd collapsed at their feet in the derrick. He was still bandaged, and a different Blaine Asher than had went in. His face was lined, and the hair next to his scalp was nearly snow white.
I'll be able to do some walking around outside in a few days,
Asher declared as he cleaned a test tube and placed it in a rack.
I can locate several wells over that underground storage cavern, and you can recover that oil, but you can't mine this field. 20 years, perhaps, and you can, but it'll take that long for those Petrolia to die out. We've got to get the oil out from below to a point where they can no longer spawn. We'll apply mining in other fields, but not here. Not here. It's up to you to see no one else tries it.
Asher lit a cigarette and nodded at Johns.
Get control of the field, anything. Tell the oilmen something, but don't tell them the truth. They wouldn't believe you. Call you raving mad. The world doesn't know. It wouldn't believe, but can we do anything other than remain silent?
R. Briggs Johns, sick of thinking of the cavern world and the horrible things below them, knew that they could not. All right. That's the end of that story. That's another really good, just short, standalone tale. I think I really much prefer when it's just like a little short, standalone tale, to go in these magazines rather than when they piecemeal up a book. Like that's what's coming next week. We're finally on the last part of Brigands of the Moon. Jeez, dude. I'm not a fan of, it's a good idea conceptually, and, if I were reading these on my own time, and not, as, the show, I would really love this, because I could just, very easily just doot, all four really quickly, so I know what's going on, but, everybody gets these episodes once a week, and oftentimes there are the better part of a month between parts of a novel. So I think the short stories just go over better. Anyway, guys, there's a board game night on campus. I'm gonna go do that. I'm gonna take Drop Mix with me, and I'm probably gonna have a good time. Hopefully, maybe we'll see. Cross my fingers. But anyway, this has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting, and I'll see you guys next week.